Hi, and welcome to Prepping Essentials. If you've been paying attention to the news media over the last few weeks, then you're probably quite concerned, and you could well be wondering if we're actually heading into Gulf War number 3. So, let's find out. There's been a long and bloody history of conflict in the Middle East, particularly so in the area known as the Persian Gulf. There have been numerous localised wars between neighbouring countries, but in recent decades we've also seen Western powers deploy their military in two full-scale invasions and wars in Iraq. We had the original Gulf War in 1990, and then the sequel Gulf War II in 2003. Wherever there's been conflict in the Middle East, it seems, according to the news headlines, that Iran has played some part in the conflict. Well, the Islamic Republic of Iran is back in the news again as a potential flashpoint for international military action. Iran has always had a bit of a checkered history in the region, and it's often come into conflict with its neighbours, both politically and militarily. Although it's an Islamic country, it observes the Shia branch of their religion, whereas its neighbours in the Gulf mostly observe the Sunni branch of the religion. It also has a history of settling its differences with the use of force. Indeed, in the 1980s, it fought a full-blown war with its neighbour Iraq. Western countries, especially the US, have a long history of political disputes with Iran, primarily due to its financial, political or military support for Shia militia groups in other countries such as Lebanon and Syria. Its strategic location on the shores of the world's main shipping route for oil, along with its quest to become a nuclear power, its refusal to recognise Israel, and its open contempt for the US make it a prime target for international condemnation and potentially for enforced regime change. Despite decades of political, financial and commercial sanctions against Iran, the country has somehow managed to remain stubbornly stable, and for the most part out of the news headlines. There's been the odd mention in regard to its support for Syria, and again more recently when the US withdrew its participation with Iran in an international nuclear control agreement. However, over the past few weeks this has all changed, and Iran is suddenly back in the news headlines after the US very publicly threatened to take military action against it. So what's happened to cause this? Well, as with all things political, it's complicated and the true facts are difficult to establish. What is clear is that towards the end of April and again in early May, the Israeli intelligence agency put out a message to its partners in the intelligence community that Iran was planning terrorist attacks on Western interests in the Gulf, and more specifically in Iraq. As a result of this, some of the more hawkish political figures in the US started making very public statements against Iran, and around the 6th of May, the US government made a decision to send a significant number of troops and military equipment into the Gulf region. This has included an aircraft carrier, B-52 nuclear bombers, and anti-missile defence systems, along of course with troops to support these things. Last weekend, on the 12th of May, news was reported from a number of sources that several oil tankers which had been moored in the UAE port of Fujairah had been attacked and damaged. These news reports were initially very confused and very contradictory, but it's since been established that a total of 4 tankers were damaged by small explosive devices. However, none were sunk or destroyed in these attacks. 2 days later, there were further news reports about drone aircraft being used to attack an oil pipeline in Saudi Arabia. Since these news reports, there's not been much additional information, but the Saudi government is placing the blame on rebel forces fighting in the neighbouring country of Yemen, a country where Saudi Arabia is currently fighting a long and bloody war in support of the Yemeni government against rebel forces which Iran publicly supports. During the past week, US intelligence agencies have issued several warnings about the possibility of further attacks, and they've raised the alert level for US staff based in the Middle East in general. Over the past few days, this has been followed with an order for non-essential staff in military and diplomatic units in Iraq to be evacuated. The degree of confusion regarding the local situation continues in the media, as at first the UK Ministry of Defence denied any specific intelligence reports to indicate an increased threat level in the area, only to subsequently retract that a day later after a fairly robust press briefing by US officials. It now seems that everyone agrees there is some kind of threat. While Iran denies any direct involvement in these recent attacks, the scale of US military capacity in the region and the language being used in the press briefings continues to escalate. While it should not be in anyone's interest to start another war in the Gulf, especially as far as Iran is concerned, with an atmosphere of increased tension and the significant military build-up in the region, there is quite a widespread concern that something which might have previously been viewed as an accident or a simple misunderstanding could instead now be used as a trigger for the outbreak of military action. Indeed, the UK Foreign Secretary stated to the media that he was concerned that a war could start by accident between Iran and the West. The tensions are also starting to take their toll economically, with the price of oil rising over 2% this week alone on the global markets. While strong rhetoric and military posturing is nothing new from either Iran or the US, the circumstances surrounding this latest incident are somewhat strange. Indeed, there are already a number of internet articles and discussions about the possibility that this is actually some kind of false flag operation designed to deliberately bring about a war with Iran. Personally, I'm not usually one who pays too much attention to conspiracy theories. However, the more I look at the surrounding circumstances, the more I am reminded of WMDs in Iraq and gas attacks in Syria, both of which subsequently turned out to be not quite what the Western governments had presented them to be at the time. Whatever the truth, the current situation in the Gulf is certainly something to keep an eye on, and perhaps it's also an appropriate time to consider increasing your stocks of fuel, or to consider potential alternative fuels to petrol or oil. A uptick in conflict in the Middle East, particularly in the Persian Gulf, will definitely result in increased oil prices, and depending on what happens, potentially there could be shortages. As with any sign of an approaching crisis, it's also a good time to take another look at your general state of preparedness. And also don't forget that historically, military action by Western governments overseas has directly resulted in numerous terrorist attacks being carried out in countries all around the world in reprisal acts. Well, that's it for this video. I hope that you found something in there that was of use to you. If you did like the video, then please do click on the like button, and also feel free to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. As always, I welcome any questions, comments or suggestions that you might have. Just leave them in the comment section below. But for now, thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.